Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I am Brian Imhauser. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Hawk Blogger. And Mike Randle of FTN Fantasy is back with us at Randle Rant on Twitter. It's game week, Mike, man. It is so great to have you here. How you doing?
Brian, refreshed and replenished, the countdown. And I have to tell you, my friend, I'm already on a natural high because I don't know if you know this about me. I graduated from Boston College.
Okay.
So how did I kick off last night? Watching a big upset at Florida State. So I'm ready to roll for the NFL. FTN, we have you covered. So honored to be here with all the great Seahawk fans as always.
It's a rough start for the Seminoles. Rough start for the Seminoles.
Brian, that's a shame, isn't it? That's a
shame. Well, Mike, as always, is brought to you by FTN Fantasy, and we have helped a lot of folks already sign up over at ftnfantasy.com. You want to make sure you get fantasy football plus or better to get Stats Hub, to get access to everything that you need. You want to use promo code HAWKS. It gets you 15% off. It is less than $8 a month. And we're going to show you a little bit today why it's something that you want to use, not just for fantasy football, but also if you're you'd like to put a little wager down. There's some stuff there we'll talk about, and also just a lot of detail on matchups and games. So ftnfantasy.com, promo code HAWKS will treat you right. Mike, where to start, man? Let's actually start with the model, because you've been teasing us about this for weeks. It hasn't been active, but as of, I don't know if it was today or yesterday, the model went live. And talk for a little bit about, like, what is the model? What is this thing that we're gonna talk about here in a second?
Our models here for betting at FTN are run by Frank Brank, who's our chief data officer, and he has run each of the games 10,000 times. So they're simulated over and over again. It eliminates bias. It eliminates what we have, which is recency bias, seeing things that can skew us, and just looks at the matchups. Brian, you'll hear a lot of times that people will say, oh, there's a line in Vegas that's begging you, or they're begging you to take this team or that team. It doesn't exist. What that means is there is a huge discrepancy between what the public thinks the line should be, or the public thinks the teams are, and what Vegas does. So when you see those lines, you check our model, you see where we have edges. And again, I mentioned it last year, biggest edge we ever had at FTN, Arizona covering a massive home spread against the Cowboys last year, week 3. They won the game outright. So what we look at here as we go through it, a 10% edge is a play for us. If you see a 10% edge on a side or a total or a prop, it's a play. 5% is worth consideration. Also, you'll see 1-2% edges either way. That's a no play for us, but that's what it is. We're trying to find edges between how we look at the games when they're repeated 10,000 times and how Vegas sees them or the public sees them.
So, Mike, I opened it up this morning and a couple things jumped out to me. I'm going to share it. Hopefully it's okay if I share my screen here a bit.
Sure.
But before I do, a couple things jumped out to me. One, the Seahawks spread last time we spoke had gone up to 5.5, and we were both like, that's a pretty big number. It's up to 6 now. Mm-hmm. So that was the number one thing that jumped out at me. The next thing that jumped out at me, and then I'll share here so people can see what I'm seeing. And let me make it big enough for everybody to see this. But here we are on FTN, and this is the Broncos versus the Seahawks. Mm-hmm. Not only does it have a 6-point spread for the Seahawks, it's got a 7.88% edge that they're going to top that spread, that they're going to cover the spread.
Yep.
Does that surprise you?
Not really, because rookie quarterbacks making their first start, Brian, specifically on the road, specifically in that situation, have not done well historically. So even someone, spoiler alert, like Caleb Williams at home, I think is going to have a tougher time than most think against the Titans. But in this case, it's Bo Nix. On the road, we project the Seahawks for 28.2 points, Broncos for only 17. That makes sense. And if you look at it, that's going to come out to 45 points, which does give also a little bit of an edge on the over. So maybe instinctually you think that, but we've talked about how potent this Seahawks offense can be. We talked about the new coaching staff and the improvements we could see on defense. And we have a rookie quarterback on the road here in one of the toughest environments in sports. So if you look at it that way, maybe it's not as surprising as we initially thought.
So then we get into the over and help folks read this. So it's got the Broncos, I think, as over 41.5.
Yep. The total.
The total.
So it says for the total of over 41.5 points, we have a 5.1% edge. Now, Brian, that incorporates also the juice, the minus 112 is incorporated in that as well. And that's a 57.93% probability of hitting. It's not a reciprocal relationship. So it's not if it's a 5.10% edge on the over, that it's a negative 5.10% edge on the under, because the juice, the variable, and remember, you have to get different books. So you have to shop around. That line of 41.5 at most books, I believe now, is 42. So again, that percentage is just related to that specific edge. But we certainly see the Seahawks posting points because we have 28 for them. There's always the chance of a late backdoor score for the Broncos in this situation. But it does make sense if you think it through. You may say, hey, Bo Nix did well in the preseason. Cortland Sutton, Sean Payton, Jaleel McLaughlin. But if you break it down and look at it, Seahawks have an edge in this game, and we think they're going to cover.
It's fascinating to me because as a Seahawks fan, Mike, seen a lot of things happen on opening day, week one, whether it's home or road. No matter how good the team is, week one is just hard to prognosticate. It really is. I did a show yesterday where I started doing a first look at the Broncos versus Seahawks, and someone was in the comments that was like, well, last year's numbers don't matter. And I'm like, well, but Vegas uses last year's numbers to set win-loss, projections for this year. Everybody has to use what they have, but it is hard that first week. And often the Seahawks offense, often the opponent's offense has trouble scoring. So I don't know if that's factored in here, the fact that this is week one, but I'm curious. Like, I doubt you know this off the top of your head, but I wouldn't be surprised if the under covers more often in week one across the board than any other week of the NFL season.
It usually is skewed a little bit to that. And I'll point out 3 examples. I did a podcast, rather, our FTN Fantasy Football podcast, posted it on Monday morning. And I looked at the games last year, Brian, that had the highest scoring averages coming into week one. And I'll pull it up right now, but I looked at it yesterday when I talked about it on the podcast. The number one game last year was the Chargers-Dolphins, which I believe had something like an over-under of 48.5, something like that. And it flew over 36-34. So it was fantastic. But the other 2 games that had high I have it right here. Sorry. The other 2 games that had high over-unders coming into week one last year was, ironically, Seattle Rams, which was 46 points, and the Bengals Browns, which was 46.5 points. Those games did not hit those numbers. And you remember the one, with the Rams, of course, there was a discrepancy between the teams. One team got out early, and it ended up being a game where both went under. This last year, the biggest scoring games were the Packers-Bears, which is rare in that if you have a divisional game in week one, usually it can sometimes skew under, but both the Packers and Bears hit 58 points and the Jaguars-Colts hit 51 points. But the Charger-Dolphin one did hit, and it hit in a big way. But you're right. Sometimes there's a discrepancy between the highest scoring games and what we see in week one and the lower scoring games, because as we go through the weeks and as we go over time, those lines are going to get sharper. So there are edges here, which is why we really love the model here at FTN, because it gets us off to a great start each and every season.
So I do not want to give away all the goodness, but I want to share one more that kind of caught my eye. And this was one of the larger edges for the week. This was the Commanders versus the Bucks.
Yep.
And this has the Bucks favored by 3.5. Bucks are at home, and it's giving a over 13% edge for the Bucks to cover that 3.5. Right?
Sure.
I'm higher on the Commanders, I think, than the general public. Yes, rookie quarterback, so I'm guessing that plays a role in this on the road in first game. I could be totally off, but I am not that impressed by Tampa in general. And I think they lost an important part with Dave Canales leaving to go to Carolina. And I think the Commanders are better than people think. So I was a little bit surprised to see this be one of the higher edges. I'm curious what your thoughts were on this one.
Yeah, this one shocked me too, Brian, because I did a win-loss preview of every team, every division. In fact, today, ironically, is the last one, which is going to be the NFC West, where I actually picked each game win-loss. I have the Commanders winning the NFC East. I think the Commanders can win this game. The lines will get sharper as the edges will get sharper as the week goes on. So right now is the initial edge. We'll see how it plays out. Certainly the model takes into account a rookie quarterback. Certainly the model takes into account last year's defense with Washington, which was not very good. I think it's going to be improved with Dan Quinn. There's questions on the offensive line. The Buccaneers, I think for 4 straight seasons, have won the division, something like that. So a lot goes into this. I agree. This one makes me nervous. I do kind of lean Washington here. Again, you don't bet across the board every edge that you see, but you look at it, you do your own research, and make your conclusion. I'm a little bit higher on the Washingtons than the public with you as well.
Okay. Now, we didn't plan this, but I've got to call you on this, okay? Because you've been awesome and you've been very honest about all your takes. I did come across your NFC West preview and your paragraph on the Seahawks. All right. I'm going to read a little snippet for you because we want to keep it real here.
Good.
Because I was curious where you were and where FTN was on the Seahawks plus 700 for winning the division. This is from a guy named Mike Randle. He says, I am bearish on the Seahawks with massive changes in the coaching staff. Seattle has a new head coach, new offensive coordinator, new defensive coordinator. That's simply too much change in a division that always produces a legit Super Bowl contender. Geno Smith is an average quarterback with one quality season. The wide receiver core is strong, but Tyler Lockett turns 32 in September. The real problem, again, is their offensive line, which ranked bottom third of the league. The Cardinals and the Seahawks are both unlikely to win the NFC West title, but odds make Arizona a much more attractive selection. Mike, answer for your sins, man. Talk us through that.
Well, I'm going to tell you what you're reading from is my preview of the divisions. And if you can look in the date on that article, that was a while ago. So what's interesting is when I went game by game through each of the games for all the divisions, I started liking Seattle a little bit more than I initially projected. The reason I put that is because of the odds and the projection on how they were going to do. But over the preseason, and as I went through each of the games, and if you can look back, you'll see the NFC West win-loss percentage coming out later today. I think you will see that I'm a little bit more positive on the Seahawks than I was at the beginning of the year. I was concerned about Geno Smith. Absolutely. Kenneth Walker, the comments that have come from the coaching staff have been incredibly positive. Metcalf, Jackson Smith and Jigba, I think is going to have a huge year. And I'm starting to get a little bit more bullish on the defense as well. So yes, that was the initial reaction when it came out to win the division. But now when you look at the win-loss records, I think, Brian, you'll be pleasantly surprised.
Love it. Love it. That was June 27th for folks that don't know.
Yes,
I did check the date, but I had to hassle you about it because wouldn't be fun if we didn't. I wanted to also, put up here one of the cool things that you guys have for fantasy, which is this, I think it's the lineup optimizer. So let me put this up here and you can kind of talk us through what we're seeing here a little bit. So I didn't know, again, I'm not the biggest fantasy football player at this point, but I went to this, and this is something as a subscriber. I am a subscriber of FTN Fantasy. I don't use it for fantasy football, ironically, or for betting. I use it because I like Stats Hub, and I'm going to show you some stuff on there in a second. But this was cool because even as someone who's not a fantasy football person, I was able to pick the Broncos players to say, okay, what does this thing say about how they're expected to perform this week? And so I think this GPP score is the thing to pay attention to. Is that right?
Yeah. So what you're looking at, I'm so happy you brought this up. This is our DFS optimizer. So when you play daily fantasy sports on Underdog, on DraftKings, on FanDuel, and you set a lineup, that's what you're looking at here. And we have Two Gun, who is a 5-time millionaire maker winner here at FTN, who has won the $1 million in these contests 5 times, which is unheard of. What we have built here is our optimizer by Alex Blickel, Caleb Nelson, our whole crew. What you're seeing, GPP, means if you select Seahawk players to be in your DFS lineup, and Kenneth Walker is going to be in a lot of mine on Sunday, that is the score that he gets for his guaranteed prize pool, meaning the large contest, Brian. The $1 million go to someone out of 300,000 people. The $25,000 goes to someone out of 100,000 people. That's the score that we project for them in terms of how we see them against other players at their position. So, for example, if you go to it and you pull up hit the GPP score, you'll see some positive ones there as well.
That's the only one that's positive for the Broncos.
And that aligns with what we have as our projection with the game as well, because we project the Seahawks to win the game comfortably. So we're not going to have high GPP scores for some of the Bronco players. But that's what we're looking at, is which players should you incorporate in your lineups. And it's not just their performance. It also factors in ownership. So, for example, if we think that DK Metcalf is going to be selected and rostered in these tournaments by over 60% of the people playing, we're going to be a little less bullish on him than some of the other players, because we're looking to get you one of those sort of off the radar, under rostered players to put in your lineups.
Yeah, I found this fascinating that this was that bearish on the Broncos players individually. Especially like Cortland Sutton is very low down here. The Broncos defense is pretty low. And the running backs, Javonte Williams, I mean, the Broncos are a credible running team. They've got a good run blocking offensive line. They've got a number of good backs. And the Seahawks were not good at defending the run last year. So that one was a little bit of a surprise to me. But I also wanted to look and show the Seahawks real quick. This one was certainly more positive. It seems to have a good opinion of how Geno will do in this game, a good opinion of how the Seahawks defense will do. And to your point, Kenneth Walker as well. DK Metcalf, Jackson Smith, and Jigba are also positive, at least in that GPP score.
Yeah, you want to have a positive GPP score, and the higher it is, the better the play is. Geno Smith is a fantastic play on Sunday, Brian. Why? Because people are going to gravitate towards some of the larger name quarterbacks, Tua Tagovailoa and Trevor Lawrence, in a game that should be very high scoring with Miami and Jacksonville. So we like Geno to perform very well on Sunday against the Broncos. And we really like Geno because we don't think many people are going to roster him at the quarterback position. So that's a great place. If you see, he's 5,500. So that is a good price for him. Most of your quarterbacks are 6,000, 6,500, 7,000. You're going to be able to save, and we think he's going to perform. The Seattle defense at 3,400 at home, 12th man. How do you not take the Seattle defense against a rookie quarterback? I don't know. But again, we don't think they're going to be rostered as much as many people think. And Kenneth Walker is a slam play for us. 6,100 is a reasonable sort of lower high-end cost player there for a rostership for Kenneth Walker.
Well, that kind of gets to the one of the other things I wanted to show here. So this is switching again and jumping all around FTN because I love to do that. This is looking at defense versus receiver. This is Stats Hub. This is looking at DVOA data. And if you look here, you can see how does a team do last year against the top wide receiver, the wide receiver one on the opposing teams. And you have to scroll quite a ways. Denver, despite the fact that they have Patrick Surtain, were 24th in the NFL against number one receivers. So I was like, well, that doesn't really match the narrative. And then you go to wide receiver twos and you scroll. Look who's dead last in the NFL last year against wide receiver twos. And so I got to tell you, Mike, I'm not a Riley Moss guy. I'm not a guy sitting here waiting, like worried about either JSN or Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf going up against Riley Moss. And there's only one Patrick Surtain on the field. I don't love their safeties either. Like, this seems like a pretty challenging matchup from a passing perspective, at least from a coverage perspective for the Broncos this week.
Yeah, because what's part and parcel with the coverage, and Surtain is incredible, but you have to get a pass rush. Here in New York, when Darrelle Revis was here, and everybody called it Revis Island, he was wonderful, fantastic player, Hall of Fame player, but they also got a lot of pressure. So the Broncos weren't able to get pressure last year. So as great as Surtain was, there were opportunities to take advantage. But even though he was there, you could see there's huge discrepancy with the wide receiver too, who people were obviously choosing to go to as much as possible. So all of that is factored into why we have Seattle winning by double digits in this game. Unless Denver's defense dramatically improves, Geno struggles, they can't separate at the wide receiver position. We don't see that being a problem, but it makes sense. There are too many offensive power players for this Seattle team for Denver to cover if they don't get consistent pressure on Geno, and that's the question.
All right, so switching over for a second on the fantasy side, since we've kind of been jumping all around, are there any like starts or sits for you this week that stand out that maybe are new or something that's changed that would affect people's lineups?
Yeah, you could make an argument if you waited on quarterback in your fantasy drafts, and I have another one tonight, my last one, Brian, tonight. It's been a labor of love. You waited on quarterback, or you're in a 2-quarterback league and you have Geno. I could make an argument that Geno should be starting over many of the other quarterbacks around him. And in a 2-quarterback format, if you have Geno, he's a full go. At the running back position, Kenneth Walker is going to be a top 10 play for me this week. I believe the 3-down skill set. I believe what the coaching staff has says, Ryan Grubb. I think that he's going to be used tremendously across the board and should get in a touchdown, no problem. Wide receivers, you're starting DK Metcalf. Fantasy football doesn't have to be hard. And I would also start Jackson Smith and Jigba at a flex position if you had it. If you waited on tight end, we talked about this before we got on the air here. I've loved Noah Fant. I've loved Noah Fant in best ball. I think there's an opportunity for him to really have a nice under-the-radar tight end season as an athletic tight end that was asked to come back by the staff and given a contract, uncertain with his health, may want to go a different direction. But if you have him and a Jonnu Smith, or you have him and a Greg Dulcich, something like that, if you waited on tight end, I would also be fine firing up Noah Fant, assuming that he starts. So really some prime matchups for the Seahawks here against Denver.
That's fascinating. The Noah Fant thing is in particularly interesting to me. So I look at that situation, and he was the 4th most targeted player for the Seahawks last year. He had 43 targets, only 32 receptions, 414 yards, 0 touchdowns. So not great. But Colby Parkinson had 34 targets, and Will Dissly had 22 targets. And those guys combined had 3 touchdowns. Those guys are gone. Mm-hmm. And they gave Fant a pretty big bag relative to, I think, what a lot of us expected. And the tight ends behind Fant this year are not really receiving. The closest one to a receiving tight end is Brady Russell. I'll give you a little tip there, Mike. That is someone that no one in the NFL has ever heard of. And there is a long shot chance that he winds up being a meaningful part of this offense. He's an interesting player. But the main point being, on one hand, it's hard for me to understand or to project and see Noah Fant getting a significant amount of target share when you've got DK Metcalf and you got JSN, who I think are going to be like hyper targeted this year. On the other hand, you've got a potential concentration of tight end targets going to Noah Fant higher than they were the last couple of years, and an offensive coordinator that certainly wants to utilize him. So I don't know personally where I am on Noah Fant as a fantasy player. It's interesting to hear your perspective of, maybe a sleeper tight end in the league.
We have our rankings up. Week 1 rankings dropped here at FTN. I have him as my 18th tight end, which may not sound like a lot, but that's a sneaky spot for him depending on how much you waited on him. And again, what you're saying is correct, Brian. I don't know if Noah Fant's going out and having 80 receptions like a David Njoku like performance, but he was such a value and selected so late. And the tight end position is so shallow that he doesn't have to have a big performance. If he catches one touchdown, I mean, Brian, Donald Parham of the Chargers was a top 5 tight end 3 times last year because he caught a touchdown. So if Noah Fant has 3 catches and one of those happens to be a touchdown, he's a tight end 1 this week. So that's what I'm saying, is that I don't think it's just that the competition is so thin. Just to let you know, Jeff Ratcliffe and I are the highest on Geno Smith. We have him at quarterback 20. He could even move up a couple spots before the end of the week. And both Jeff and I have Kenneth Walker as a top 12 running back this week. He has him at 11. I have him at overall running back 12. So high on the Seahawk core players. And Noah Fant, just get in the end zone. I don't need 5 for 80. I need 3 for 40 and a touchdown. And you got yourself a great value there late in the draft.
Awesome. All right. Well, so let's get into some of the questions submitted by our Patreon members over at patreon.com/hawkblogger, as well as YouTube members, club level and higher, have been able to submit these. And then we've got some in chat. I think we'll have time to get to those this week as well. Before we do, want to just remind folks, make sure you head over to ftnfantasy.com, sign up with promo code HAWKS. Get access to all this content. Like almost everything I'm showing you is only available to people that are subscribers, and you want to make sure that you sign up for Fantasy Football Plus or higher, because that's what gets you Stats Hub. So absolutely, I am a subscriber. Will continue to be a subscriber. It's the only place you can get DVOA data, and I just love. I use that site every single day, and learned a lot from it. So. By the way, one of the other things I found on there is Aaron has all the historical DVOA data that you can download. So for a while, I thought I could only get to 2020, but you can actually get all the historical. So I went back and I was looking at all the historical stuff. You can download it, use it in Excel. Maybe you're not as geeky as I am, but I like doing that stuff. It's been great to see. So let's get into some of these questions, Mike. First one, actually first 2 come from Braxton, who's one of our patrons. He says, do I start Javonte Williams against the Seahawks or Jerome Ford against the Cowboys in my RB2 spot?
That's a great question. When I make these choices, my suggestion would be for the people who send these questions, and thank you, is you have to select your team as you think the game is going to go. I think the Browns are going to beat the Cowboys. I think it's going to be a close game at home. I don't think the Cowboys are ready right now. You know, CeeDee Lamb came in late. Their defense was opportunistic last year, but the Browns front was lethal. So in that situation, I'm going to lead Jerome Ford. I am worried about the goal line carries going to Deonta Foreman, who was let go and they brought him back, or Pierre Strong. Ford is not a goal line back, but he had 44 receptions last year. He was great in the receiving game. Deshaun Watson certainly is going to look for some positive connections to build off what was really a rough performance. And with the Broncos, I like Jaleel McLaughlin better than Javonte Williams because I do think Seattle's going to be up. I do think that Broncos are going to be coming from behind, and I think they're going to have to gain a lot of points dumping off to McLaughlin and having them in sort of a chase mode throughout the game. So in that situation, I would go with Jerome Ford. Yes, Williams is going to get the goal line carries if they get close, unless Peyton goes with Audric Estime, which would really frustrate the Javonte Williams owners. But I like McLaughlin a little bit better in this matchup than Williams, so I'll take Ford over Williams in that choice.
All right, Braxton, I think anticipated you might say that because he has a follow-up. He says, in the same vein, Jerome Ford or David Montgomery against the Rams.
In that situation, I'm going with Monty. The Lions at home are only 3.5-point favorite over the Rams, Brian. I don't like that at all. I think the Lions are going to roll this game. They're great on the offensive line. Montgomery gets the goal line carries, especially with Jahmyr Gibbs having a slight hamstring injury in the preseason. In that matchup, I would favor Monty. You give me 2 running backs, pretty much equal, and one gets the goal line carries. That's where I'm going to go each time.
All right. We have got another question here from a YouTube member saying, what is your one underdog you would bet to cover the spread this week?
Boy, that is a great question, and I'm glad you asked because I just sent in my money line underdogs today, and there are 2 of them. The one I'm going to give you is the Carolina Panthers over the New Orleans Saints. As soon as this was posted, I grabbed it. Panthers were 2-15, Brian, last year. Terrible record. But their projected win total coming into the year was 7.5. So Bryce Young was rough. They struggled all year. Fine. Canales comes over, who you mentioned before. They add Deontay Johnson. They add the rookie and Xavier Leggett. They have Chuba Hubbard in the backfield, who's going to assume that Rachaad White role. And I like what the defensive coordinator has done last year. They had a ton of injuries, but they still ranked top 10 in DVOA against wide receiver twos, and they were third best in DVOA against wide receiver threes. So Ejiro Evero should have a much improved defense. I don't like the Saints. Dennis Allen, as a head coach, 24-46. That's 34% over his coaching career. That is the worst, Brian, among all active head coaches in the NFL. I projected New Orleans for a disappointing 4-13 season. Derek Carr also has not been great as a betting favorite quarterback. He is 74-83-3 against the spread per Bet Labs. I like the Panthers. All signs point to the Panthers here. I think they upset the Saints on the road, shocking everyone except for me because everyone has recency bias and they were so bad last year.
Interesting. Yeah. Panthers are going to be an interesting one to watch. We've got some questions submitted in chat. Let's get to these. Smokehawk asks, what do the stats say is the best bet for the Seahawks in the first game?
Gosh, I have to look at our prop projections. Obviously, the side right now would be the first play for me. I would not touch that total. But if you're looking for prop projections, I can pull it up and see what they say here. I'll look for it. And we go to the next question. But
sure.
Yeah, I would say the side right now is a strong play for us so far at FTN Fantasy. And let me see what the props say as well.
Okay. While you're looking that up, let me pull up the next. This comes from Jess Honcoop, who, by the way, also I think is an FTN subscriber. I'll show here. She's been reading the FTN draft guides and finds them very helpful. Now, I'm assuming gender there. I might be off, so we'll find out. Jess asks, which receivers are due for the biggest fantasy bump this year?
And our prop shop is not up yet. It will be up in a day or so. The props always we get a little bit later.
Okay.
So those should be up in a day. Biggest fantasy bumps this year. Just, it is very hard for me not to recommend to you Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin has been the number one wide receiver with Washington, and their quarterback play has been putrid. Now the top 4 targets from last year after McLaurin are all gone and not on the team. They tried to bring in Martavis Bryant because they needed a wide receiver too. He's going to have a ton of volume. I think he has a huge bump from last year and does very, very well. Other receivers that I would look at as well for that this year, George Pickens is ready to ascend to the wide receiver 1 role. If you notice, Jess, I'm talking about teams that people are shying away from in fantasy because they want wide receivers and explosive offenses. What I'm doing are taking wide receivers that I think have a massive target share in an offense that people may think is going to underperform. So George Pickens, no Deontay Johnson. Yes, it's Russ there, but Russ connected on for 10 touchdowns with Cortland Sutton last year, and they did not add Brandon Ayuk. So I think George Pickens and Terry McLaurin do for a massive target share and should have very strong fantasy floors with very high upside ceilings as well.
All right. Nate Schutz, a YouTube member, says, we've covered this maybe, but is Mike a hero running back guy building a fantasy team?
Yeah, I'm a hero running back guy if I can get Christian McCaffrey or Breece Hall. Other than that, I'm 0 RB. I think Bijan Robinson is going to be good, but not great. I think he's going to share touches with Tyler Algier. I have no interest in Devon Achane. Gibbs is nice, but his price is a little too high. So if I can get Breece Hall, who had 70 receptions last year with Zach Wilson at quarterback, I will take him or Christian McCaffrey and then fill in wide receivers. But if I cannot get one of those 2 running backs, I'm going 0 RB and taking 3, 4, maybe even 5 wide receivers to start my drafts.
All right. Jess is back again. Is it worth taking any of the Green Bay receivers? Who's going to get the most targets there?
Jess, the answer is Christian Watson. It is going to be Christian Watson. His prop, I just put this in our Discord, our betting Discord, is 37.5 receiving yards on Friday. Jess, you can take this to the bank. That receiving yardage prop will not be that low for the rest of the year. Whenever he's been healthy and whenever he's been on the field, he is the clear wide receiver 1 in Green Bay. I talked to Andy Herman from the Pack-A-Day podcast. He said Christian Watson can do things that none of these other receivers can. He can have 200 receiving yards in a game. He can catch 2 50-yard touchdown passes. The issue was he was always injured. Well, they found out why he was injured this offseason because there was a hamstring sort of a discrepancy between the strength in one hamstring and the other. One was 40% stronger than the other. They have eliminated that. He has 4.3 speed. He's caught a touchdown every 2 games he's played in the NFL. Jordan Love's ready to ascend. He is the top wide receiver. The other ones will be good, but Watson should be the best.
All right. Ryan B, YouTube member, asks Watson or Daubs as a wide receiver 4.
Yeah,
I think you
I'm
answered
going
that.
with Watson. I'm going Watson. I like Dubs, and both of them start in 2 wide receiver sets, but Watson to me is the clear better, more athletic receiver.
All right. And Chase Van Loo says, I have 2 start sit questions. Geno Smith or Jaden Daniels week 1, and JSN or Calvin Ridley.
First one is Geno. I like Jaden Daniels, but as Brian I just mentioned, he's on the road against a tough Tampa Bay defense. So if you want safety and a high floor, it's Geno. So it's Geno for me. Boy, the second one is tough. I like Tennessee in that game. That was the second game I wrote up from my money line underdog because everyone is on the Bears. But first of all, Callahan has come over as the new head coach. He brought his father, who's one of the best offensive line coaches in the NFL. I think Tennessee has just as many weapons as Chicago does, and they don't have a rookie quarterback because Will Levis played last year. Boy, that's close. I would take Calvin Ridley, but it's very close. It's hard for me to recommend JSN as the number 2 option in Seattle over Calvin Ridley, who I think is the number 1 option. Remember, DeAndre Hopkins still injured, coming back from an injury there in the preseason. So I was slight lean to Calvin Ridley, but it's a coin flip.
All right, we have Keith Lavelle gifting 5 Hawkwalker memberships, which I absolutely love and really appreciate the generosity. And Keith, welcome to the crew as well. When people do this, it's a great way to bring other people into the crew. And also, if you get one of these free memberships, really think about paying it forward. I think that's something that's become kind of a tradition here. Someone gets a free membership, they give a free membership or 5 or 10 or whatever. And it just helps bring in more kind, more, generous people into the community. So really, really appreciate this, Keith. And thanks for doing that. All right. So Mike, you had asked me, I think before the show, you had a question for me, I think about the wide receiver situation in Seattle. So curious if you still have that question.
Well, now I think I have an answer from what you told me, but I'm curious what you think is going to be the Tyler Lockett situation, because we know DK Metcalf is great. And I'm curious how much JSN can really ascend in the first game to the wide receiver 2 spot. But Brian, you are the expert, so I turn it to you.
Well, I mean, this is all part of the fun of this Seahawks season. Is not only is every team a projection at this point because we don't have any information about them. The Seahawks are probably one of the teams we have the least amount of, priors to base things on, with all the new coaching staff, and with this mix of youth and experience. And the wide receiver room is a perfect example of that. You've got DK Metcalf that's been in the league for a while. He's in his prime as a player. And you've got Tyler Lockett, who's on the older side of his career. And then you've got JSN in his second year. And you can't forget about Jake Bobo, and Laviska Shenault is going to be a bigger part of this offense than people realize. Even Derek Young may get a snap here and there. So that's a very deep receiver room. And Tyler Lockett, when we talked to him yesterday, I asked him about this receiver room and their identity. And he's like, I have no idea. I just know it's the best receiver room I've ever been in. And I also asked him about, hey, look, the narrative is that you took a step back in explosive plays last year. That's been one of the things you're known for through your career. Do you think that could change in this new offense? And he said, it depends on what they asked me to do. That last year they asked him to do less of that, and that he was a decoy a fair amount at times last year. And so it really depends on how they use him. And here's the thing, Mike, I think the most clarity I have is that DK Metcalf and JSN are due for just massive years. I really think both of those players are going to set new standards for their performance in the league. And Tyler, I just assume, is going to have less of a share of targets. If you would ask me right now, I feel like Tyler is going to get a lower share of targets, but is going to be a highly productive player within those targets. I think he might be more sneaky as an explosive player this year, because people are going to have to really concentrate quite a bit on these other 2 players, not to mention Kenneth Walker coming out of the backfield as a receiver as well. So I think there's a lot of reasons where in any other year, Tyler Lockett's a guy that people are like, okay, we got to make sure we're planning and containing him. I think he's going to end up being 3rd or 4th on most defensive coordinators' lists for who to stop. And I don't think Tyler Lockett has eroded in his skill set enough to where that's a safe thing to do. So I think he could absolutely have some big games this year. Wouldn't shock me if he has some 100+ yard games and 1 or 2 touchdown games. I don't think that's going to be the rule, though. I think that'll be more the exception than the rule.
I think, Brian, part of the reason that everyone is into a JSN explosion is, one, because he's super talented. 2, he was injured at the beginning of last year. But 3, I think there's a little bit of uncertainty around DK Metcalf because he dropped off with his reception total so much. And my response to that is I think it makes DK Metcalf also a value, because I think he is much more likely to repeat the 90 and 1,100, give or take, season from 2 years ago than the 66, 1,100 from last year. So I agree with you. And Tyler Lockett is going to have some big plays in this offense because people are going to forget about him. Defenses are going to forget about him as JSN ascends. But not only do I like JSN, I think DK Metcalf is also a buy because people are worried that he's becoming this feast or famine player because of such the lower number for him in receptions last year. I think that's a mistake.
All right, Mike. I think we've covered a lot of ground, covered a lot of questions. I cannot wait for the season to kick off. 2 nights, 2 days. I mean, we are like day after tomorrow, we get NFL football starting and we get a Friday game. And then we get it all kicked off on Sunday. What are your plans for the weekend? How do you NFL your first week of the season?
It's just so busy here at FTN, Brian. We want to make sure everything gets off to the right start with the fantasy rankings, the picks, the bets. We have our betting show. Our college football show is doing well also. So really, it's just staying local, staying around the house, making sure everything works smoothly, because then it's on repeat every week from here on out. But getting our rankings, getting our model set, charting the picks here, getting some DFS lineups. And of course, Brian, joining you next week, when I win the $1 million in DFS using our optimizer. That's the plan.
Oh, wait. So what you're saying is even after you win the $1 million, you're still going to be, coming on here and answering questions
bright and early. Maybe I have a little bit of a gold chain around my neck, but that's it.
What would be your first move if you actually won $1 million?
Oh my gosh. My family we've been renting down the Jersey Shore every summer for like the last decade. I'd love to get a shore house for the family. My parents are older. They're in their 80s. My dad's turning 80 this year. So that would probably be, selfishly, that'd be our first move. Is I would love it. I have an old car, a Nissan Rogue from 2012, and it works. So I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
But we love going down the shore with the kids and going to the beach. So that'd probably be my first move.
I love it. All right, Mike, thank you so much for another great show. That is Mike Randle. You can find him on Twitter at Randle Rant. And you can find all this great content, all this stuff we've been talking about, and play around with this yourself over at ftnfantasy.com. Use promo code HAWK, get 15% off. And again, you want to make sure you get Fantasy Football Plus or greater, because that is what's going to get you Stats Hub. That's what's going to get you access to all the stuff. That's what I have. And again, less than $8 a month with promo code HAWKS. So, Mike, have a great rest of your week. Let's hope that your prognostications on FTN Fantasy are correct about the Hawks this week against the Broncos. I know a lot of Seahawks fans would breathe a big sigh of relief if they had a relatively comfortable win. That's not something a lot of Seahawks fans are accustomed to at this point.
Let's get a Kenneth Walker touchdown, a JSN touchdown, and a double-digit victory for Seattle, and we'll have a nice martini on Sunday in the Seahawks honor. How about that?
I love it. All right, everybody. That is it for this episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I will be back with you here in just a short while with Robert Mays of The Athletic. So make sure you tune in for that episode as well. For now, I'm Brian Emhouse. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Hawk Blogger. And again, you can find Mike Randle at Randle Rant. Take care, everybody. This has been another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings.